The evening light turned the main street into a strip of hammered copper, and Eleanor Hartman stood in the center with her baby tucked against her chest. Dust lifted in little spirals around her boots and settled on the worn blue of her dress. The child slept, a warm weight steadier than her breath. Ellie was 19, broad-shouldered, soft-cheeked, and careful with her steps, the sort of woman this town measured first by size and only later by kindness. She had learned how to fold herself without vanishing. She faced the mercantile door and waited for whatever would step through it, while the town watched from porches with the patient hunger of crows. Caleb Hartman stepped out of the mercantile with a coil of rawhide looped in his hand. The bell snapped at the air when the door thumped behind him. He looked not at Ellie but through her as if she were heat haze. "You shame me," he said in a voice tuned for porches, asking for credit like a drayman in front of men. "You make me a beggar." Ellie lifted the baby higher so the small head could nestle under her chin. "We are nearly out of flour," she said. "Michael will be hungry in the morning." Caleb's smile was thin as wire. "Michael will be fed," he answered, "and you will remember your place." He looped the rawhide tighter and raised a fraction. Along the porch, the farrier paused with his tin cup halfway to his mouth. Two boys went still as fence posts. Widow Mayfield pinched her mouth into a sharp little bud. Sheriff Amos Klein hunched deeper in his chair, brim low, drowsy as if the heat had forgiven him every decision. "Please, Caleb," Ellie said, offering the only door she had. "Let's go home." She wanted shadows, a closed room, any corner without eyes. The town smelled of sun-warmed leather, horse, and molasses. A sign chain squeaked. A fly worried a window. Somewhere, unseen, someone whistled and tried not to sound interested. Caleb lifted the rawhide higher, making the lesson public. "You apologize here," he said, "where you forgot yourself." He squared his shoulders to his audience. The leather swung with a clean hiss and snapped her sleeve. The sound traveled. The baby startled and cried, small hands knotting in her collar. Heat came under the fabric in a narrow streak that burned more from being watched than from pain. Ellie did not flinch. She kissed her child's hair and rocked on the balls of her feet the way her mother had taught her, a quiet tide refusing to rise to the moon of spectacle. Sheriff Klein shifted. The farrier spat a dark arc into dust. Widow Mayfield breathed, "Sad business," in the tone of someone who believes naming a thing is the same as mending it. No one stood. Silence presented itself as order and passed for wisdom. At the far end of the street, a tall rider drew his horse to a halt and dismounted as if the ground had invited him. He was Apache by dress and bearing. Braided hair, broad shoulders under a faded shirt, a posture loose and watchful. He tied his mount with 3 lean motions and walked toward the square. Stride unhurried, gaze level as water in a cupped hand. People noticed him the way a field notices weather, first by color, then by temperature. Caleb swung again. The rawhide's tip flicked Ellie's forearm. Micah's cry climbed from alarm toward panic. Ellie angled her body so the blow would not cross the child. She tasted iron, though there was no blood, only humiliation souring her mouth. She breathed with the rhythm of the baby's breath. She stood as still as a post and let the wind take what she could not stop. The tall man had crossed half the distance. He stopped 3 paces away and looked at Caleb as one might look at a fire licking the wrong grass. Then he looked at Ellie and dipped his head a fraction. Not apology, not command. Respect that traveled the shortest road. Caleb saw the glance and stiffened. He liked an order with his own name on it. "Mind your path," he told the stranger. "This is my wife." The man's eyes returned to Caleb and did not blink. When he spoke, his English was low and careful. "You teach by hurting," he said. "People forget such lessons when the hurt leaves." Caleb's laugh was quick and mean. "A show makes memory," he said, and he raised the rawhide a 3rd time, angling the lash to leave its mark where it would advertise. The stranger's hand came up in the arc, fingers closing on leather. The rawhide sagged between them like a snake caught behind the head. For an instant the street forgot to breathe. Ellie did not realize she had stepped back until her heel touched the wheel of a water cart. Micah pressed his wet face into her neck and hiccuped between cries. The stranger released the leather and did not move away. He had not struck Caleb. He had only ended a sentence. Sheriff Klein rose at last and cleared his throat. "That's enough," he called, as if words had scooped spilled grain back into a sack. The air did not obey him. Caleb shoved a rawhide into his belt and reached toward the baby instead, anger shaping his hand into a hook. Ellie tightened her hold, but the blanket snagged his fingers and gave. "If you won't behave, I'll take him," he said. Beard thinned his breath and pride had thickened his eyes. The stranger placed his body between them with the ease of a pine stepping between wind and grass. He did not touch Caleb. He did not raise his hands. He stood, a simple, stubborn fact. The air bent around him. Relief loosened Ellie's knees, a feeling she would not show where watchers could drink it like fresh gossip. Widow Mayfield's voice drifted from the porch, brittle as china. "Someone fetch the pastor," she said to no one brave enough to own the errand. Caleb looked at the sheriff and found only weariness, then back at Ellie with a glitter that promised the bill would be collected later. "You make me look small," he hissed, though the stranger stood in plain sight. "You big clumsy." The word died, strangled by calculation. Ellie met his eyes. Something in her took its shape, no blaze, only outline. "Let us go home," she said, and the quiet iron in her voice surprised them both. "We'll talk there." Caleb took a half step, and the stranger mirrored it without seeming to move. Frustration snapped across Caleb's face. He darted sideways to reach for the baby from the other angle. The stranger's forearm rose and brushed his hand away. Not a blow, a redirection. A few men coughed short laughs behind their knuckles. Humiliation rides faster than justice. Caleb cocked his fist. Ellie's breath hit the cage of her ribs. Sheriff Klein lifted a hand. "Stand down," he said, voice rough with delayed duty. "There's a baby wailing, and that's sermon enough." The stranger looked at Ellie as if asking a question without words. She understood. She nodded once. He stepped aside just enough to make a corridor nobody else could see. Ellie walked through it, her shoulder brushing his sleeve for the span of a heartbeat. She did not look back. Eyes on her felt like heat from an oven door. Caleb did not follow. He stood with the rawhide drooping from his belt, counting witnesses and composing a version of himself he could live with. Sheriff Klein watched him as a man watches weather, hoping for rain, expecting dust. At last Caleb spat into the street and turned toward the saloon, where cold beer could hammer his intention into a simpler shape. Ellie moved into the shadow between buildings and let herself breathe. Micah's cries fell to hiccups and then to damp sighs. She rocked heel to toe and hummed a tune that had lived in her since kitchens were safe. When she looked up, the stranger waited at a decent distance, gaze lowered, as if he knew the difference between help and intrusion. "Thank you," Ellie said. Gratitude steadied her voice. He lifted his eyes. "For now," he answered, and the phrase lay over her shoulders like a shawl against wind. "I am Tayan Red Elk." "Eleanor," she said, then softened it. "Ellie Hartman." She angled the blanket, so Micah's cheeks stayed covered. "I don't know how to repay." "You do not owe," Tayan said. He glanced toward the saloon where laughter already tried to stitch Caleb a new story. The man bleeds from pride. He presses the sword to feel alive. "He can be better," Ellie said, "because hope needs somewhere to sleep. He was gentler once." Tayan neither argued nor agreed. "Sometimes a river forgets its banks after heavy rain," he said. "It remembers when the ground is drunk." He looked at Micah, whose lashes were clumped with tears. Your son is strong. Ellie heard the kindness land without noise. He is, she said, and the truth of it calmed her hands. Are you passing through? I follow a long road, Tayan said, but a horse rests where the shade is honest. The corner of his mouth tilted, not quite a smile. I will be near tonight. Ellie nodded once. Thank you for standing between, she said. She could not name what had changed, only that something in her posture had shifted toward fullness. Tayan stepped back, making space around the moment, and Ellie took the narrow lane home beneath cottonwoods. She felt his footsteps behind her at a distance that was decent and real. Snatches of porch talk followed and fell away like burrs on a hem. Trouble follows kindness, Widow Mayfield said for any ear. Another voice answered, maybe kindness builds its own law. Leaves blurred the words. Ellie kept walking, gathering herself around the sleeping child. The lane smelled of damp earth and old shade. The Hartman house waited at the end, white paint peeling in long curls, windows catching a last coin of sun. Ellie eased the door open with her hip and stepped into a kitchen kept tidy the way some people keep faith. She set Micah into a basket near the hearth and tucked the blanket around him. A pale welt had risen under her sleeve. She rolled the fabric back, dampened a cloth, and pressed it to the sting. Cool and heat met like two notes that argued and then agreed. Micah sighed and slackened into sleep. Ellie sat on the floor beside him and let the quiet reach her. The house spoke in small ways, a board settling, a kettle ticking, the distant wing beat of something at the eaves. The hush was not safety, but it was a room where fear did not own every chair. She could breathe without performing. She could count the ways the day might have been worse, and refuse to pay them more mind than they deserved. Bootsteps sounded on the path, the cadence of a man persuading himself he was right. Caleb's shadow crossed the threshold before he did. Beer and dust rode in with him. He stopped when he saw the welt on her arm. His jaw clenched and loosened. Shame flickered and hit as quick as a lizard under a rock. You made a scene, he said. You made it, Ellie answered. Surprise lay in the evenness of her voice. It's over. Nothing's over, he replied. You won't make me small in front of men, and then trade looks with a savage like I'm smoke. Ellie stood so her body was between him and the basket. He stopped you from hurting me more, she said. That is the shape of it. Caleb stepped close enough that heat rolled off him. You think I won't finish what I started because some painted giant played hero? He glanced at the basket and back at Ellie. You forget the order. The order, Ellie said softly, is that Micah sleeps. She set the words down like a small fence, not to imprison, to mark. You can speak low, or go outside and speak loud to the wind. For a heartbeat his mouth softened, as if a different man stood behind his eyes. Then something colder returned, thin and bright as wire. We will talk, he said, choosing the word that let him keep power without using it. He moved to the table, sat and ate the stew she set before him with the quick, practical motions of a man fueling a body. She sat opposite and watched not to measure him against hope, but to count the weather inside him. When he finished, he set the spoon down with care. Tomorrow you'll apologize to Mr. Phelan, he said. Your tone was out of line. My tone was need, Ellie said. I'll thank him for the credit. I won't apologize for asking to feed our child. He studied her as if the line she drew were a crack in a window he hadn't noticed. He pushed back his chair. I'll sleep in the shed, he said, punishment that left him in charge of explanations. Think on your place. Ellie nodded, because nodding sometimes spends less of a person than arguing does. Good night, she said. He left. The door closed with a tired sound. Night lifted its slow cool from ground. Ellie rinsed the cloth, wrung it out, and pressed it gently to the welt. She felt the house breathe with her. She thought of Tayan's steady eyes and of the sheriff's late voice and of the town's silence that had tried to pass for wisdom. She would live with all of it, not as a victim of it, but as someone who knows the exact weight she can carry. She went to the window. A coin slice of moon rode low between the cottonwoods. Somewhere far off a coyote called. Thin and practical, a report more than a lament. Ellie closed the shutter and stood a moment listening to Micah's even breaths. She imagined a river returning to its banks after too much rain. She imagined drawing a line no one else could see, then choosing, in each small hour, to hold to it. She lifted Micah and kissed the damp crown of his head. "We are all right," she whispered. The words felt true enough to stand on. She laid him in his cradle, tucked the blanket, and returned to lower the lamp. Darkness gathered like cloth around a tender thing. In that dark she shaped a promise not to declare but to keep. To walk tomorrow with her chin level and her step steady, no smaller than the work of loving her child requires. She lay down with her palm over the tender welt and let the house settle. The night kept its appointments. She did not know what Kayla would do, or whether the tall stranger would still be in town when the sun pulled gold over the eaves. She knew only that the corridor which had opened in the street still existed inside her, a space made when someone stood between harm and habit, a space where she could move forward. Sleep came slowly like mercy. When it came, it felt like the first door of a long hallway opening without squeaking. Ellie breathed into the quiet and let it hold her. Outside, leaves traded opinions. Inside, the cradle creaked as the baby surrendered his sorrow. The morning broke without apology, all pale light and cold breath on the glass. Ellie rose before the frost had finished drawing its lace on the window. She moved quietly, heating water over the stove, careful not to wake Micah until the fire had steadied. The welt on her arm had faded to a mottled green, tender when her sleeve brushed it. She tied her hair back, feeling the weight of it settle down her spine. Caleb was gone. He had left before dawn, the shed empty but for the smell of smoke and leather. His absences were not a relief so much as a pause between blows, a space where her mind could think without flinching. Micah stirred and whimpered. She lifted him, pressing her cheek to his, feeling the warm damp of his breath. He clutched a lock of her hair as she fed him, and in that small tug she found a rhythm steadier than the one her life gave her. She dressed him in a clean shirt and wrapped him in the blanket she'd stitched from scraps, each square scrap of her mother's dresses. The cloth had worn soft from washing, holding warmth like a quiet hand. By mid-morning, she stepped outside to draw water from the well. The air was thin and sharp enough to make her eyes water. She set the bucket on the worn boards and began winding the rope, each turn a slow drag over the skin of her palms. The rope creaked, the pulley groaned, and the bucket came up heavy with cold. She had just bent to lift it when a shadow passed across the well's rim. Tayan Red Elk stood opposite her, his hands empty, his eyes taking in her effort without pity. Without a word, he reached for the rope, his fingers closing over it as if the weight meant nothing. He drew the bucket up the last foot and set it on the boards. The water barely trembled. "Thank you," Ellie said, her voice smaller than she meant it to be. Tayan nodded once. "Your hands are marked," he said, looking at the red impressions the rope had left. "They'll fade," she replied. "Fading does not mean forgotten," he said, and his gaze flicked briefly toward her sleeve before returning to her face. He did not step closer, but his presence seemed to fill the air between them. Ellie dipped the smaller pail into the bucket and poured water into her tin basin. Micah cooed from the crook of her arm, reaching toward the tall man with a tiny fist. Tayan glanced at the child, his expression softening by a fraction. "Your son is not afraid," he said. "He doesn't know the world yet," Ellie replied. "I'd like to keep it that way for a while." Tayan looked toward the road where the dust from an early rider hung like a ribbon. "Dust always finds its way inside," he said, almost to himself. He stepped back, letting her pass, and she walked toward the house with the water sloshing in her basin. She could feel his eyes on her, not as possession, but as witness. Inside, she set Micah down in his basket and began kneading the dough for bread. Her hands worked the flour and water, folding and pressing, feeling the stubborn give of it. She thought of Tan's hands on the rope, steady, unhurried, certain, and of how quickly Caleb's hand could turn into a whip. The contrast was too sharp to ignore, and yet thinking of it filled her with a guilty heat she couldn't name. By afternoon, she walked into town with Micah bundled against her. Caleb had not said when he'd return, and there was no meat left in the house. She needed salt pork from a mercantile, and dared the risk of more whispers. The street was busy, wagons rattling over the hard-packed dirt, the smell of horse and smoke heavy in the air. Widow Mayfield was perched outside the post office, her knitting needles flashing in the weak sunlight. "Well, now," she said as Ellie passed, "you've got a fine day for walking, Mrs. Hartman. I hear you had company yesterday." Ellie paused, knowing the hook when she saw it. "If you mean the gentleman who stopped my husband from making a further scene, yes," she said evenly. The widow's eyebrows rose, her mouth curving in satisfaction. "Apache gentleman," she corrected, drawing out the word like taffy. "And I hear he's been seen near your place more than once." Ellie adjusted Micah's blanket and kept her voice calm. "The well is public," she said. "Some people draw water without malice." Widow Mayfield murmured, clicking her needles together. "Some people draw other things." Ellie walked on, not trusting herself to speak again, without giving the woman more thread for her loom of talk. She felt the weight of eyes on her as she stepped into the mercantile. Inside, the air smelled of dry goods and oiled wood. Mr. Phelan behind the counter gave her a polite nod, the sort that kept the exchange from being too warm or too cold. She asked for the pork, sugar, and lamp oil, her voice clear. When she stepped back into the street, Tan was there, leaning lightly against a hitching post outside the blacksmith's. He straightened when he saw her, his gaze taking in the small bag in her hand and the child in her arms. "You walk alone," he said. "I'm used to it," she replied. "Used to it is not the same as safe," he said. She looked at him then, the breadth of him, the unhurried way he took in the world. "Safety," she said quietly, "is knowing which dangers you can bear." His eyes held hers for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the street. "And which you will not," he said. A rider clattered past, forcing her to step nearer to him. She caught the faint scent of leather and wood smoke. He moved a fraction closer to shield her from the spray of dirt. No one else would have noticed the gesture, but she did, and it lodged somewhere deep. The walk back to her home felt shorter with him, beside her. He did not speak much, only once to point out a hawk circling high above. She followed his finger, watching the birds slow wheel against the sky. "He sees far," Tan said, "far enough to choose where to strike." At her gate, he stopped. "The wind will turn cold tonight," he said. "Keep your child near the fire." "I will," she said. "And you?" "I have my horse, and a blanket made for colder nights than this." He hesitated, then added, "If trouble comes, light a lamp in your east window." Ellie nodded, unsure she would ever do such a thing, but grateful for the offer. He turned and walked back toward town, his shadow long in the late sun. That night, Caleb returned. The smell of whiskey followed him inside. His eyes were sharp, not from drink, but from the certainty that something had shifted. "I hear talk," he said, dropping his coat on the chair. "There's always talk," Ellie replied. "This is about you," he said. "You and that Apache." Ellie looked up from the hearth, where she was turning the bread on its board. "He drew water for me," she said simply. Caleb's jaw worked. "And he's been seen walking you home." "He walks where he pleases," she said. "I don't command him." "You could tell him to stay away," Caleb said. Ellie met his eyes, the space inside her widening like that corridor in the street days before. "I could," she said, "but I won't." His mouth twisted, half snarl, half something else. "You think he cares for you?" "He doesn't. He's watching for weakness." "Then he's not alone," she said, the words out before she could recall them. His hand twitched at his side, but he did not move closer. Instead, he turned away and poured himself a drink. Ellie lay awake long after he'd gone to sleep in the shed again. The wind rattled the shutters, and Micah murmured in his sleep. She thought of the hawk, of the circle it made above the world, choosing where to strike. She thought of the lamp in the east window, and how light could be both a signal and a shield. In the following days, she saw Tan twice more, once at the well, where he handed her the rope before she could take it, and once on the road, where he dismounted to let her pass on the narrow stretch. Each time, there was no excess in his words, only the steady recognition that she was not invisible. But the town's eyes sharpened. Widow Mayfield's murmurs grew louder. Even Sheriff Klein looked at her longer than he used to, as though measuring something he couldn't name. Caleb spoke little to her, but his silences felt loaded, like a sky swollen with storm. One evening, she found a small bundle on her porch. Inside, a baby's moccasin, finely stitched from soft deerskin, no note. She knew without doubt it was Tan's work. She held it in her palm, feeling the smoothness, the care in every stitch. She tucked it away in the drawer beneath the flour sack, hidden but not denied. Caleb found it 3 nights later. He came in with mud on his boots and the bundle in his hand. "What's this?" he demanded. "A gift," she said. From him. Caleb said, "Do you take me for a fool?" "I take you for a man who knows when he's being cruel," she said, her voice low. "And who sees when someone else is kind." He slammed the moccasin onto the table. "You're making me a joke." "You're making yourself one," she said, and the words landed between them like a dropped stone. He stepped toward her, then stopped, breathing hard. His eyes slid to Micah, who was watching from the cradle. "Maybe my sister would raise him better," Caleb said. Ellie's hand went to cradle's edge. "He stays with me," she said, her voice steady. "That's not your choice alone," Caleb replied. "Remember that." That night, she sat by the hearth long after the fire had burned the coals, Micah asleep on her lap. She felt the weight of the moccasin in the drawer, the truth of what it meant, that someone saw her not as a burden or a shame, but as a mother worth guarding. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. Ellie looked toward the east window and thought, for the first time, that she might light the lamp. The rain came in the night, steady as a drumbeat, softening the dust into dark, clinging mud. By morning, the streets were a patchwork of puddles, each holding a slice of gray sky. Ellie stood at the window with Micah in her arms, watching the drops slide down the glass. The house felt close, as though the air had thickened with the damp. Caleb had not spoken to her since the night he found the moccasin, but his silence had grown heavier, the kind that waits for a spark. She fed Micah, wrapped him in his blanket, and tried to busy herself with small chores, sweeping the floor, mending the frayed hem of her dress. Yet her mind kept circling the same thought, Caleb's eyes when he'd mentioned his sister. There had been calculation there, not just temper. By late morning, she heard the sound of hooves in the yard. Caleb entered without knocking, his boots caked with mud, his coat smelling of wet wool and whiskey. He set a folded piece of paper on the table and looked at her without warmth. "I've written to my sister," he said. "She'll take the boy for a spell. Give you time to remember what a wife's place is." Ellie felt the blood drain from her face, her hand tightening around Micah until he whimpered. "You won't," she said, but her voice was quieter than she intended. Caleb smirked, the kind of smile that lived only to wound. "I will, And if you fight me, you'll wish you hadn't. He poured himself coffee, ignoring the way her breath came quicker. This town's already talking. Best not to give them more reason. You're the one giving them reason, she said, and the words surprised her with their steadiness. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. Careful, Ellie. You're starting to sound like you believe you have a choice. Her mind raced. She knew he could make good on his threat. Men here had handed children off for less, and the law, in this place, belonged more to the loud than the just. She thought of Tayan's offer, the lamp in the east window, and the space he'd stood in that day in the street. A small, stubborn seed of defiance took root in her chest. That afternoon, when Caleb left again, she carried Micah into town. The clouds had begun to break, letting weak sunlight spill across the roofs. She walked straight to the blacksmith's, knowing Tayan sometimes stopped there for supplies. Sure enough, he was leaning against the doorway, speaking quietly with the smith. When he saw her, his expression shifted, not surprise, but a kind of quiet readiness, as though he had been waiting for her to appear. "I need to speak with you," she said. He stepped aside, letting her pass into the dim, warm air of the shop. The smell of iron and coal clung to everything. Micah stirred, restless in the heat. Tayan waited until the smith had moved out of earshot before speaking. "Your husband has made a move," he said. Ellie's eyes widened. "How do you know?" "The wind carries more than dust," he said. "I hear things. He means to take your child." Her hands tightened on Micah's blanket. "I won't let him." Tayan studied her for a long moment, his gaze measuring not her fear, but her resolve. "Then you will need help," he said. "But help is a bridge. You must decide to walk it." "I'm walking," she said. He nodded once. "Then listen. Caleb is not a man who will strike in the open where others might stop him. He will choose a moment when you are alone, when the law cannot see. You must be ready before that moment comes." Ellie swallowed. "What do I do?" "You keep the child near you, always. And if you see him take the road toward you with purpose, light the lamp in the east window. I will come." She wanted to ask why. Why he cared, why he had taken this upon himself. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said, "Thank you," and meant it with more weight than the words could hold. Over the next 2 days, she lived with new awareness, her ears tuned to every hoofbeat on the road, her eyes catching each shadow that moved near the house. Caleb returned briefly to eat and to speak in vague threats, then left again, his absence feeling less like reprieve and more like the tightening of a noose. Micah sensed her tension, waking more often in the night, his cries sharp in the stillness. On the third evening, the sky was the color of bruised slate, the wind carrying the smell of rain that would not fall. Ellie was rocking Micah by the hearth when she heard the sound of a single horse approaching at a trot. The rhythm was purposeful, each hoof strike clear against the packed earth. She stood, moving to the window, through the narrow gap in the curtain. She saw Caleb's shape in the saddle, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on the house. Her breath caught. She turned to the small oil lamp on the shelf and lit it, setting it in the east-facing window. The flame trembled once before steadying. She did not know how far Tayan might be, or if he would even see it. But the act itself made her spine straighten. Caleb dismounted, tying his horse to the post. He walked to the door and stepped inside without knocking, his boots leaving damp prints on the floor. "I've come for the boy," he said, his voice flat. "You're not taking him," Ellie said, her body between Caleb and the cradle. His eyes narrowed. "You think you can stop me?" "I know I can try," she said, and something in her tone made him pause, just for a breath. Then he stepped forward, his hand reaching toward Micah. A shadow filled the doorway. Caleb froze, his hand still halfway extended. Tayan stood there, the light from the window catching the wet dark of his hair, the bulk of him framed against the fading sky. He stepped inside, his presence quiet but absolute. "You heard her," Tayan said. Caleb's jaw worked. "This is between me and my wife." "This is between a man and his choice," Tayan replied, his voice calm. "You choose to take from the weak. I choose to stop you." Caleb's gaze flicked between them, his pride prickling under the weight of being defied. "You think you can protect her forever?" "I can stand here now," Tayan said. "That is enough." For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with the sound of the wind against the walls. Then Caleb's lip curled in something like a smile, but it was thin and empty. "This isn't over," he said, stepping back toward the door. "No," Tayan said, "it isn't. But tonight it ends this way." Caleb left without another word, the door closing hard behind him. Ellie stood very still, her hands trembling as she reached for Micah. The baby's eyes were wide but calm, as though he sensed the danger had passed. "Thank you," she said to Tayan, her voice low. He shook his head. "I told you, I stand between when I can, but the rest is yours." She met his eyes, feeling the truth of it. "I know," she said, "but it's easier to remember my own strength when someone else believes in it." He looked at her for a moment longer, then inclined his head and stepped back into the night. She watched him go, his shadow melting into the dark, the sound of his horse's hooves fading down the road. Ellie closed the door and leaned against it, holding Micah close. The flame in the east window still burned, a small, stubborn light against the dark. She knew Caleb would return, perhaps angrier, perhaps more careful. But something had shifted in her tonight, something she could not give back. She had stood her ground, and though it was Tayan's presence that had kept the worst from happening, it was her voice that had refused to bend. When she blew out the lamp, the smell of warm oil lingered in the air, a reminder that sometimes a signal is not just for the one who comes to answer it. It is also for the one who lit it. The days that followed were taut with kind of silence that could snap without warning. Caleb did not come home for 2 nights, and when he finally appeared, his eyes were roaring, his face bristled, his shirt clinging with the sour smell of drink and horse sweat. He said nothing to Ellie, only glanced at Micah in his cradle, as if taking an inventory. She kept her back straight while she moved about the kitchen, laying bread on the table and pouring water into a tin cup. Her every motion was deliberate, steady, as though refusing to match the uneven rhythm of his presence. He ate without speaking, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the food. When he finally set the cup down, he spoke in a voice low enough to make her lean toward him. "Tomorrow," he said, "you and the boy will come to town. There's talk to quiet, and you'll stand beside me while I quiet it." Ellie felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. Town was a stage. He'd humiliate her there if it kept the whispers from bending toward him. "We're not part of a performance," she said, and the words surprised her with their calm. His eyes sharpened, and for a long moment they held each other's gaze, neither blinking. He pushed his chair back slowly, the scrape of wood on the floor loud in the small room. "You'll come," he said, and left without finishing the bread. That night, Ellie lay awake, listening to the wind skitter through the cottonwoods. Micah stirred once, whimpering, and she soothed him back into sleep. In the darkness, she thought of the way Caleb's voice had sounded, not just threatening but certain. He had a plan, and when Caleb's mind latched onto a plan, he pursued it like a starving hound. The next morning, she dressed Michael warmly and tucked him into the blanket. She stepped outside to hang the wash, her eyes scanning the horizon without meaning to. Across the road, a figure emerged from the edge of the trees. Tayan walked toward her with that same unhurried stride, his eyes searching hers as he approached. "He means to shame you again," he said without preamble. "I know," Ellie answered. "This time, I think he means to do worse." Tayan studied her for a moment. "The river floods when the rain is heavy," he said. If you stand still, it will take you. If you move, you can choose your ground. She knew what he meant. I can't run, she said, but I can choose where I stand. He nodded, the faintest motion, and handed her something small, another moccasin, this one slightly larger, stitched with a red thread along the edge. For when he walks, Tayan said, if you still have him. Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. I will, she said, more to herself than to him. By midday, Caleb returned, the smell of dust and leather clinging to him. Come, he ordered. We're going to town. Ellie wrapped Micah, her arms forming a shield around him as they walked to the wagon. She could feel the eyes on her before they reached the square. The townsfolk had gathered loosely, drawn by the pull of spectacle and the hope for something to talk about over supper. The air held that brittle quality of anticipation, like glass waiting for a stone. Caleb stopped in the center, his boots planted wide. My wife, he said to no one in particular, has been keeping strange company. A man who thinks he can step between a husband and his home. I'm here to remind her where she belongs. The crowd shifted, the murmur rising. Ellie felt the heat creep up her neck, but kept her chin level. Micah stirred against her chest, sensing the tension. Caleb stepped closer, his voice turning into something the crowd could lean into. You've forgotten yourself, he said to her. Forgotten your vows. And now, before God and these witnesses, you'll... He never finished. The sound of hooves cut through his words, slow and deliberate, from far into the street. Tayan rode in, his horse moving with a measured grace that turned every head. He dismounted without haste, tying the reins loosely to the post, his gaze never leaving Caleb. I told you before, Tayan said, stepping forward. No man harms a mother before my eyes. Caleb's laugh was sharp, but it wavered at the edges. You think you can tell me how to keep my house? I think your house has no walls strong enough to hide what you do, Tayan replied. The crowd drew in tighter. The air charged. Sheriff Klein stepped off the porch, his eyes moving between the two men. This doesn't need to turn ugly, the sheriff said, but his voice lacked conviction. Caleb moved fast then, his hand darting toward Micah. Ellie turned away, clutching her son, but Caleb's fingers brushed the edge of the blanket. Before he could grip, Tayan's arm came up, his hand catching Caleb's wrist with a force that froze him in place. Enough, Tayan said, his voice deep and quiet. Caleb yanked back, fury in the flush of his cheeks. You're making a fool of me. You made that choice yourself, Tayan said. Caleb's hand went to his belt, where the rawhide hung coiled. The crowd tensed. Sheriff Klein's hand hovered near his sidearm, but didn't draw. Tayan stepped between Caleb and Ellie, his height casting a shadow over them both. You can lead with your pride, he said, or stay and lose more than that. For a moment, it seemed Caleb might strike anyway, but something in the weight of Tayan's gaze held him. He let the rawhide drop back against his thigh. This isn't finished, he muttered, but the words lacked teeth. Sheriff Klein stepped forward then, his voice carrying. Caleb Hartman, I've heard enough of what's been going on under your roof to call it what it is. A crime. You'll come with me. The crowd parted as the sheriff took Caleb by the arm, not roughly, but with the kind of firmness that leaves no room for argument. Caleb shot one last look at Ellie, something between rage and disbelief, before being led toward the jailhouse. The square was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes when something long tolerated has finally been named. Ellie stood still, Micah pressed close, the thud of her heart slowing. Tayan turned to her, his eyes softening. It's over for now, he said. She nodded. The words caught somewhere in her throat. Thank you, she managed. He shook his head. I only stood where you were already standing. The rest was yours. She looked around the square, seeing faces she'd known for years, now turned toward her with something different in their gaze. Not quite approval, not yet, but something that might grow into it. Tayan handed her the second moccasin. "For when he walks," he repeated. She took it, feeling the smooth leather under her fingers, and realized her hands were steady. "He will," she said. "And when he does, I'll tell him who made these." Tayan gave a small nod, then stepped back to his horse. "You won't need the lamp again," he said, "but keep it just in case." She watched him ride away, the crowd slowly dispersing. The square felt wider than it had that morning, the air lighter. She turned toward home, each step measured, not hurried. That evening, she set Micah in his cradle and placed the moccasins on the shelf above him. The light from the hearth warmed the leather, making the red stitching glow. She sat by the fire, the silence around her no longer heavy but full, like a deep breath after a long climb. Later, she stood by the east window, looking out at the dark. The lamp sat unlit on the sill, its glass catching the faint reflection of her face. She thought of the corridor in the street when Tayan had stepped between her and harm, and of the space inside herself that had grown since then. That space was hers now. Not borrowed, not guarded by another, but built from the ground up by every moment she had chosen to stand. She turned from the window, her gaze falling on Micah's sleeping face. The world outside was still the same, sharp-edged, sometimes cruel, but she was not the same woman who had stood in the square with her head bowed. She had walked through shame, through silence, and found herself still upright. In the quiet, she spoke aloud, not at anyone in particular. "Some rescues," she said, "do not come with roaring guns or shouted vows. Sometimes they come as a shadow that stands between you and the darkness, until you remember you were meant to stand on your own." She banked the fire, the glow fading to embers, and carried the lamp to the table. It sat there unlit, a reminder not of fear, but of choice. When she lay down, Micah's small breaths filling the room, she knew that whatever came next, she would meet it without lowering her eyes. The corridor was still there. It was wide enough now for both of them to walk through.